Hello everyone, I'm Priyadarshini Mahara, faculty at the Department of Buddhist Studies, University of Delhi. Today I'm going to discuss with you module number 39 of paper number 11, Philosophy of Buddhism. This module is entitled as Relation of Consciousness and Rebirth. So here, when we talk about relationship of consciousness and rebirth, we are first going to see what are these Buddhist concepts of consciousness and rebirth. So when we talk about rebirth, rebirth in Buddhism is the doctrine that the evolving consciousness or stream of consciousness upon death becomes one of the contributing causes for arising of a new generation. So when we look at this concept of rebirth, we see that rebirth is the main concept. Karma and rebirth, when we say, then rebirth is one of the most important concepts of Buddhist philosophy. So they say that when you talk about rebirth, rebirth is the doctrine that the evolving consciousness or stream of consciousness. So the evolving consciousness and that stream of consciousness that is present in a particular being that makes you aware of a particular thing. So every moment you are in that state of awareness. And that is how you can describe the things that exist around you or the phenomenal existence. So this consciousness holds a lot of importance when we talk about existence. So here when we see that the doctrine that the evolving consciousness or streams of consciousness upon death, or death is also known as the dissolution of the aggregates, becomes one of the contributing causes for the arising of a new generation. So this consciousness is that which gives rise to another generation. It is obvious that there are other factors that are playing their role, but consciousness holds importance in the sense that when you are in a state of death, or once you are dead and then you are born again, this consciousness plays an important role in your next birth. The consciousness in the new person is neither identical nor entirely different from that in the deceased, but the two form a causal continuum or stream. So you cannot say that if suppose I am dead today and I'm being born again tomorrow. So when I'm saying that the stream of consciousness and consciousness plays role in my next birth, you cannot say that it is absolutely identical, or that the way I am today, I am totally that way in my next birth. But it also cannot be said that it is opposite. Rather, it is said that the two form a causal continuum or stream. So there's that causal continuum or a stream of consciousness that is being passed on from one birth to the other. There's no word corresponding exactly to the English terms rebirth, transmigration, or reincarnation in the traditional Buddhist languages of Pali and Sanskrit. The entire process of change from one life to the next life is called punar-abhav or punarbhav in Pali, which literally means becoming again, or more briefly, bhav, becoming, while the state one is born into, the individual process of being born or coming into the world in any way is referred to simply by birth or jati. So when we look at this particular term birth or jati, it is our presence or our coming into existence in the phenomenal world. Our conception already is in a cyclic form and it keeps going on. So even before we are born, when we use this term birth or jati, even before coming into birth or jati, we are already conceived in the present world by being present in our mother's womb. And even at the time of dying, that very moment we form, because of this continuous conscious streams, we are born again, or we take the conception into some other life. The entire universal process that gives rise to this is called samsara. So when we talk about samsara, it is this worldly process or the cyclic process of birth and rebirth that constitutes a samsara. When we are born, when we live our life, and we are dead again, and again we take a rebirth in another form, with these consciousness stream flowing from one birth to the other, connecting one birth to another, and that is what constitutes the entire samsara or empirical existence. When you look around, every existent thing that comes into being, be it a living being or a non-living being, goes through this process, through this cyclic process of coming into existence, of sustaining, and then of ceasing. So, suppose for that matter, let us take a table. What is a table? Table is something that is made up of certain material. So without those materials, it does not have any identity. Once you remove those legs of a table, would it still be a table? No, it would be called probably a writing board, but not a table. So when you look at a table, there is a time when the wood, suppose if it is a wooden table, or for that matter even an iron table, iron starts to rust, wood starts to go bad, and there is a time when the table is no more a table. It just falls apart. So the same way, when we talk about the beings, the living beings, we know that every living being comes into existence, and there is a certain time period for which he or she or any being stays. And then there is a time when the being leaves this empirical world. And the same way, any non-living things also have this cyclic process of coming into existence and of ceasing the existence. So now when we talk about death or maran, it is not the end. Here we are not putting an end to our cycle. All we are doing is just the momentary stoppage is being made here, and this consciousness stream is leading us to from one birth to another. So the Buddha's concept was distinct, consistent with the common notion of a sequence of lives over a very long time period, but constrained by two core concepts: that there is no irreducible self tying these lives together, which means anatta, and that all compounded things are subject to dissolution, including all the components of human person and personality, which means anicca. So when we talk about anatta, we say that there is nothing that can be reduced by self tying these lives together. And when we talk about anicca, we say that the dissolution has to happen, including all the components. No factor is remained when the dissolution takes place. It all transforms into ashes. The story of Buddha's life presented in the early text does not allude to the idea of rebirth prior to his enlightenment, leading some to suggest that he discovered it for himself. The Buddha's detailed conception of connections between actions, which is termed as karma, rebirth and causality, is set out in the 12 links of dependent origination. So when we talk about dependent origination, which is also called Pratitya Samutpad in Sanskrit and Paticca Samutpad in Pali, we have 12 links, and these 12 links connect you to your past life, to your present life, and to your future life. So this, if you look at those 12 links, we won't be talking about those 12 links here because there's a separate module on the notion of Pratitya Samutpad. So when we look at these 12 links, we see that it all begins with the first link, which is called Avidya or ignorance. Now this Avidya or ignorance is attached to every being, and it stays with that being, be it in the previous life or in the present life or in the future life. So when we talk about this ignorance is that everything is in a constant state of flux and everything is not permanent, but still there is attachment to things, and that is what leads to your rebirth. Now how does all this is connected, or how does all these things matter when it comes to rebirth, when it comes to a person being born again? So we would be talking about this now. When we talk about ignorance, when we talk about causality, when we talk about actions, when we talk about rebirth, we see that they are all related. Now how are they all related? When we talk about ignorance, because of ignorance and in the prevailment of ignorance, we tend to do certain actions that are not worthy of doing. And because we have those actions, we have to have the resultant of those actions. So this is called vipak. The resultant is called karma vipak. So those actions have resultants, and in order to suffice those resultants, we are born again. We see that everything is in a state of causal and effect relationship. Everything that comes into existence is because of certain cause, and that particular effect becomes the cause for another effect. So there's that cyclic moment where we're talking about cause and effect. One thing being the cause and giving rise to a certain effect. Now that very effect becomes the cause for another effect, and it goes on endlessly in that cyclic moment. And that is the reason there are certain actions that are given rise to, and those actions, because they are under the category of ignorance, you don't know the resultant of those actions. So they are ignorant actions, and that leads to rebirth. So if you have done certain actions, maybe you will get the vipak or resultant in this present life, but not always. Not all your actions are the resultant of all your actions come in this very life. So that is the reason you are born again, to suffice those resultants of your previous life actions. According to the Buddhist Anatta doctrine, our conscious mind is nothing but a complex compound of fleeting mental stages. So when we look at our mind, it, according to Buddhism, is nothing but a complex compound of fleeting mental states. A conscious thought phases through three phases, and first is an arising or genesis phase, second is a static or development phase, and the third is a cessation or dissolution state. So when we talk about the conscious states, and when we talk about three states coming into existence, that is arising, development and cessation, the same way the consciousness arises, the being also arises. The same way consciousness develops, a being also develops. And the same way consciousness comes to an end, the being also comes to an end. But this end is again momentary. It is not permanent, because you are born again. That consciousness leads you, or the stream of consciousness leads you from one birth to another. Immediately after the cessation stage of thought, there occurs the stage of subsequent thought. So you cannot say that this cessation of the stage of thought is the end, because the subsequent stage of thought arises immediately when one thought process comes to an end. When you look at the everyday life, when you look at all the feelings and emotions that you have, when we talk about every feeling of happiness or unhappiness, we see that this feeling of happiness arises, then it stays. Maybe sometimes it stays for a longer while, depending on your potency of taking things in a lighter way, and then it ceases to exist. And then another state of mind or attitude or feeling or emotion comes into an existence. So the same way, when we talk about the arising of unhappiness, it can also arise, stay, and generally if we see, then this state of unhappiness is prolonged, and that is done by human beings themselves. Anyhow, so when we're talking about this prolongment of unhappiness, there's a time when it ends. If you remember, then there most of the times you say that why does only unhappiness take so long to end? And that is the realization that everything is endowed with suffering. All human existence is endowed with suffering, and clinging on to these endowments of suffering will not take you out from that suffering, will not prolong your happiness. Instead, it will prolong your unhappiness. And one needs to understand this. So this thought process is never-ending thought process. When a human being is in the state of development, then also thousands and thousands of thought processes come into existence and cease. So if you see, then there is a circle of existence where human being is coming into existence, then there is that development of existence, and then cessation of existence. Now, if you look at every emotion and feelings that arises within that particular circle is what we're trying to point out here. Now, within that big circle, there are many small circles inside that talk about the coming into being, the sustenance and the cessation of thousands of emotions and feelings. And that is what is the conscious state, and this state or the flowing of stream of conscious states give rise to another birth. Taken together, these thoughts form a seemingly never-ending stream of consciousness. So when you look at that big circle and you look at those small circles inside that big circle, you see that it is seemingly never-ending stream of consciousness. These thoughts are part of an ever-changing life process. Each thought, on passing away, transmits its whole energy and all of its recorded impressions to its successor. So now suppose I am the queen or the king of a particular region, and then before I pass away, I give the throne to my heir. And now when it comes to the heir, or when it comes to the successor, before he or she passes away, she is going to give away the throne to her or his heir. So this process continuously goes on and on. And the same way, when we talk about our life, it is ever-changing process. Each thought on passing away transmits its whole energy and all of the recorded impressions to its successor. That is the reason we remember all these things, all these emotions, and they are constantly acting in our lives. Every fresh conscious thought consists of the potentialities of its predecessor together with something more. A subsequent thought increment is neither identical to its predecessor nor entirely independent of it, both being part of the same continuity of karma. Thus, with respect to consciousness, in every temporal moment there is birth, and in every moment there is death. So as we talked about, that there is arising, there is development, or maybe you can say that staying for a while, and then there is cessation. This happens with every thought process, even within an individual. Consciousness has birth as its source and death as its end. So we can say that consciousness should be envisioned as a juxtaposition of these fleeting mental states, as opposed to imposition of such mental states as many religions such as Hinduism appear to believe. So we don't want to get into any sort of controversy here. It is just for a basic idea or making a difference here. Our ordinary perception of human consciousness is similar to the perception of a flashing or a flash of lightning containing a succession of sparks that follow upon one another with such rapidity that the human retina cannot perceive them separately. So here what we pointing out, or the example that we using, is that when we talk about consciousness, it is like the flashing of light. So do you realize when the flashing of lightning happens? You see the lightning, of course, but that flash that comes into movement in just seconds or fractions of seconds rise to lightning. Same way, those small momentary attitudes give rise to consciousness, which you cannot perceive separately. So there is that stream flowing, and that stream is not being able to be separated from the consciousness. The same way, when we talk about the flash of lightning, and we look at the ordinary person, we see that without proper instruction, we cannot perceive this rapid succession of separate mental states. Ordinary human consciousness is in being or alive only for one thought moment. The moment your thought process comes into an end, the consciousness disappears. So this is what we've talked about consciousness. So consciousness is a stream of energy flowing, and it keeps coming into existence and disappears. And it is in a constant movement. Now when we look at rebirth, we see that in Buddhism, birth is the arising of psychophysical phenomena. Death is merely the temporary end of temporary phenomena. So when we talk about death, we are not saying that it is the end, but all that we're saying is it is temporary end. And what is it temporary end of? It is a temporary end of temporary phenomena. So this phenomena is not permanent, and when we talk about death, we're pointing out to this temporary end of what is temporary phenomena. Just as the arising of physical state is conditioned by its preceding causal states, so the appearance of psychophysical phenomena is conditioned by anterior to its birth. We see that everything, the process of birth and death is temporary. It is related. An individual human self is considered to be merely a flux or continuity. The self includes both mental and physical elements. So when we talk about the end of the self or end of a being, we're not pointing out to only the end of this physical form that we have. We are also pointing out to the end of mental states. This end, however, is not permanent. It is only the attainment of nirvana that is permanent end to this cycle of birth and death. When we're talking about just death of the physical body and the mental attitudes, it is only for a time being. The moment we die, that very moment, our conscious states take us to another birth. And that is the cycle of life. The self includes both mental and physical elements. It is karmic force of each individual that binds these elements together. So now, suppose this is my body. I have done certain actions. I performed certain actions and the resultant is yet to be achieved. So now if I am dying and being born as some other person, then this body is transforming into another body, and that body requires something common, right? My conscious state is giving birth to another conscious state, and it is the karmic actions karmic forces that lead one life to another life. This uninterrupted flux or continuity of psychophysical phenomena, which is conditioned by karma, is not limited only to the present life, but has its source in an indefinite past and will continue on into the indefinite future. So when we talk about our karmic actions, we're not talking only about the present life or to the future life. We are also talking about those karmic actions that were performed by us in our previous life, and that which gave presence or which gave rise to our present life. So when we look at this term, we see that our previous actions gave rise to our present life, and our present life will give rise to our future life. The concept is Buddhist substitute for the permanent self and immortal soul believed in most of the world. So there's no talking about soul or the theory of Atman in Buddhism. Buddhism does not have anything to say about the soul or Atman. They say that the candle represents physical bodies and the flame represents the mind. So the simile that is being used here is that of a candle and its flame. When we talk about candle, it is like the physical body, and the flame is like the mental states. These two work harmoniously together. When you look at a lit candle, you see that the candle is there and the flame is lit. And do you see that the flame is lit somewhere else and the body stands somewhere else? That is not possible. So the only possibility is that the candle has its flame. And we see that they both work harmoniously. So an interplay of mind and body, which is the unit, is what we're trying to point out here when we give the example of candle and its flame. The same way, body and the mind, which is termed to be its flame, is more of a unit. This combination of mind and body is what we usually think of as ourselves. The body gets older and older as the years pass by, and there's a moment when it decays. Just like the candle is incapable of being used anymore, the mind, like the flame, twists and turns constantly, the same yet not the same, different yet not different, from moment to moment, day to day, year to year, and Buddhists would add from life to life. So isn't it beautiful the way they've described the candle and its flame just as a human being or a body and its mental states? When we look at the candle, there's a point when all the wax burns out and the flame is not there anymore. So the same way, there's a point in our life when the body burns down and the flame exists but does not exist as well. So those mental states are said to be existing as well as non-existing, and they might be different but they are same. They might be from moment to moment, day to day, year to year, and Buddhists also add to it that from life to life. There is nothing permanent or static in the candle or the flame. They are constantly changing. The same way, there is nothing permanent in the mind or body, and they are constantly in a state of flux from one moment to the other. So, when we talk about the relationship between consciousness and rebirth, we just have to understand and remember this one thing, that our rebirth is led through the conscious states which flow from one birth to another, along with certain other factors that give rise to a person, or that takes a person from one birth to another. Karma here also plays an important role. Therefore, it can be stated that the consciousness is rebirth linking consciousness. And it is present the moment we arise, it is present even while we are developing, and it is present even when we cease to exist. And this is the theory of consciousness, or this is the relationship of consciousness and rebirth. Thank you.